Here we are, and off we go. Anyway, look, it's fantastic to be in Veszprém. I've not been here before, so it's a privilege to have been invited. And there's one Hungarian word I'm trying to pronounce. Also-ish? Is that? Anyway, fantastic. Hungarian is something different. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about, and if this thing works, it would be wonderful. Most cities, of course, are thinking, where are they going and how do I get there? And so are you. And what's interesting, this is going backwards. Let me just go forwards. That's it. I've now learned, because the thing has disappeared here. Anyway, so most cities, of course, and when I say cities in this context, obviously region, because of what the mayor has just said, and so on. And so I've been asking myself, what is a city? And so much of a city is hidden. It's somewhere else. You don't really know what it is. And so the interesting question I've asked myself many, many times is that. And what I think, there's a quote by a man called Patrick Geddes, who was a biologist, a biologist and an urban planner from 130 years ago. And he said, a city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time. And I think that's absolutely beautiful and encapsulates so much of what needs to happen. And what needs to happen in cities, because there are so many things involved, is an alignment, is a form of orchestration, bringing these things together, which is precisely what the mayor just pointed out a second ago. And it partly is, of course, about memory, and that's often gets, of course, forgotten. We forget the memory, we forget the good things about the memory. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, of course. So it's memory too. And of course, we all know it's people, but they're also different and they don't all think the same way. It's activities, interesting ones, boring ones, day-to-day ones, exciting ones. It's, of course, what is the economic base of a city. It's the hardware, lots of concrete and all of that. Perhaps there's too much concrete. It's the software, it's all the little invisible things that make the lights go on and things like that. But it's also, if I can use computer language, it's the orgware, the organizational culture. Is it an open culture? Is it a closed culture? Is it an inclusive culture? And so on. And then, of course, the networks in the city are the different elements, the different groupings coming together. And are they actually forming a mosaic? Are they actually collaborating? Because that clearly, if a city wants to move forward, is vital. And what one is really doing is calibrating a series of things. Obviously, the public domain, the private domain, the NGO, the not-for-profit sector, the civic world, and academia in its various guises, and so on. And all of this, if it is orchestrated, can generate some sort of forward momentum, some ambition. And out of that, like Veszprém region is doing, you are in the process of, and have already, created a story that you're trying to get to speak to everyone, to all, in that complexity. And that, I think, then generates that real movement, that forward movement, and perhaps resonance. Because as we know, all places have a problem, particularly smaller places, of younger people in particular leaving. But if you have this other story that is compelling and speaks to all, perhaps they will come back, and they should come back, and so on. So you get the idea. But all of that together, all of these elements, is actually a culture. So city making, region making, in that sense, is one of the biggest cultural projects of our time, if not the biggest. But the problem so often is that culture, people think, is that thing, that extra. Oh, the decoration on top. Not you, of course, but in general. And that is sometimes the problem of persuading people. So the people who are in finance or economics sometimes think, the cultural people are a bit vague or whatever, but actually how we think of economics, the form of economics, the form of finance is itself cultural. That's why Swedish capitalism is different from American and Japanese capitalism, as an example. And all of that still doesn't tell us exactly what the future is, and that's why everybody needs their plan. Their plan B, perhaps it's the plan A, I don't know. So then one asks oneself, one's got all these elements, now what? What happens? How are we going to get beyond the brick wall and do something interesting? And here I think we could discuss, and if you don't mind, I'll talk to you a bit about the creative city and cultural city idea, its past, its present, and its future. Now, one particular aspect I want to highlight is the difference, and I'll come to that a bit later, between cultural planning and planning culturally. Cultural planning is about, you know what that is, hardware and so on. Planning culturally is a much bigger thing. It's thinking about things through cultural insight. And that reminds us that the second skin we have, the city has, organizations have, is this cultural skin. This is the second skin. It's the other invisible, if you want to put it like this, the other invisible hand that determines things. Now, I was doing an exhibition in Sicily, and we rode around in this funny cart called The Art of City Making, Creative City Making, and it helped me try to encapsulate some of the thoughts I've been having over the last periods. And one of them is this notion, and you could call it a guiding principle, and it's a question I always ask a place. In this place we would say, is this city region a place of just projects, or is the city the project? It sounds simplistic, but it's a dramatic difference. If you say the city is a project rather than there are lots of projects here, you're beginning to orchestrate and bring these elements together. Another thing, as we all know, everybody knows, but sometimes we don't treat the city as a living organism. We treat it as dead and, you know, asphalt, concrete, bricks, and so on. And that's where I think the sensory perspective is really important, how the city feels as one wanders around. So, for example, the moment Rita showed me this room, I thought, hey, this is a lovely room. It's all very comfortable, the material on the chairs, I love it. I love the pictures. So from a sensory perspective, the experience and even walking onto this stage was really a positive one. And the same thing one can apply as you're walking around and navigating a city. So that sensory perspective on cities is one of the primary things I think exists, because perception, the experience of how a place is the very first thing that happens in our mind. And if it is good, you open out. If it is bad, you probably close in. And in that sense, I think everybody is a great urban designer, because we all know as we're walking around places, do we close in or do we open out? So another guiding principle for me, at least, is always leave room for the unknown, because we just don't know. It's indefinite. Leave or have room for the unexpected. And some of the unexpected things are very surprising. Look up Kristiansand, the Kunstsilo. It's amazing. It just happened out of the blue. A person said, I've got a collection. He gave Kristiansand 30 million euros, and there was suddenly this thing that looked dead, that came alive and was very interesting. So in terms of thinking about creativity, it is important to leave room for experimentation and R&D, research and development. Because if we were a company, we would, of course, say, we've got some research and development going on, because otherwise we would probably go bankrupt. We need to trial and test in the city as well, which is why ECOC is so brilliant, because you can try and test things. The good things that succeed can stay on. The things that didn't work, well, we move on. And then that reminds me that when we're just thinking about things, there's obviously the rational, and I'm sure you've been incredibly rational and logical and been doing everything in a very correct, planned way. But then I think there's also the irrational. Now, the a-rational is not the irrational. And what's so interesting about creativity, and particularly, for example, arts, is it sometimes lifts you into a different thing that doesn't fit the normal format. So I think the a-rational is quite interesting, to put it mildly. But of course, all of the things I'm saying require courage, and you as Veszprém have shown the courage as a region to explore these things and do things that you might have not thought you would do before. So when we look back, the then and now of cultural planning, what we had, I'm simplifying, is Culture 1.0, which is the repertoire. You know what that repertoire is, building cultural institutions. This is a library, I happen to like it, it's in Rio de Janeiro, doesn't matter. Or it could be, of course, a Bilbao type thing, and then you add Jeff Koons's puppy in front of it, and it looks really quite interesting, I suppose. And then you have things like the Millennium Park, Anush Kapoor in Chicago, which is one of the central gathering places of the city, because everything is reflected through the mirrors of it. Or you have Linz round the corner, of course. This is Arts Electronica. Many of you will, of course, been there. And then there are, of course, slightly mad things, like this is Daniel Liebeskind in Toronto. For me, that's too jaggedy and sort of uncomfortable. He probably thinks it's wonderful, but that's his opinion, perhaps. Anyway, all I'm saying, this 1.0 is this repertoire, the museum, the art gallery, all of these things you put together. And you might have an opera house, and as it says here, in what sort of future do we want to live? In welcher Zukunft wollen wir leben? And then you have, and I'm simplifying, 1, 2, 3, 4, Culture 2.0 is when you merge in all the arguments about, hey guys, culture is more than just these infrastructures. There's all these activities, and they become an economy, and this economy is much bigger than you thought. And when you add all the elements together, dance, music, design, and so on, you suddenly have quite a large proportion of jobs and so on, which then shapes the way a place looks. And this is just a celebration in Mannheim, good city to compare yourself with in Germany, where you can see the words like innovation, culture, architecture, networking, and so on. So that's, let's say, another phase. And the third phase, I'm just saying it in simple terms, is where we begin to think of the participative imperative, you know, where we are makers, shapers, co-creators of the evolving culture. We always were, but we're more explicit about it. And that's when we're doing things together in one way or another. And that might be like in Nantes here, I mean, you know, all you're doing, in fact, is sitting on the elephant, but nevertheless, it's an interesting experience. Or you're creating a festival, or you're doing things that allow people to self-express themselves. And then another guiding principle, I would say, is obvious, is really trying to look at things through the eyes of the next generation, of the young, and capture their sense of belonging. The mayor used the word belonging, or Nora did, I'm not sure. Someone just used the word belonging. And that's really important. I happened to be walking past the lift the other day, and it said, "Can you make doors open for me?" And then, thank God, the lift doors opened. But this is only a metaphor to say, are we actually looking at it through the eyes of the young? So Katowice, for example, decided to focus on gaming. They just invited, in fact, StarCraft to come to have their event, and 65,000 visitors come now to Katowice. But they've also created a cluster, as an implication of that, for gaming and the gaming industry, which is keeping the young in Katowice. That's just one example. So the question always is to a city, are you listening? Is there trust between you and the citizens and so on? You know of this, of course. And could you invent something else? So, for example, Turin has something called the Biennale Democrazia. So you could invent anything. All I'm really saying, there are so many niches to be explored, which most, you know, there are probably 1,000 niches. So you can always be unique in one way. So back to that image of the senses, you could say culture 4.0 is that sensorized cities where everything is digitized, AI is moving, we're completely immersed in this world. It probably drives us crazy because we don't even know who we are anymore. We'll put that aside. But anyway, I'm just adding these things together, and a cultural world has all of these elements, of course. So what we had then, of course, historically, I don't know about Veszprém, let's say Germany, culture's role was never really challenged. It was always on an endless growth path. It was a classic, I don't know, auditing people did. How many museums and theatres have we got? We need more money. You remember that. For some countries it was like this. Not for Britain, in fact, but that's a different story. So then, what then happened became the big justification dynamic. For example, in Britain, everything was calculated. How much is it worth? Can you build up the evidence that you have actually validity and importance? And then people talked about the spin-offs and spillovers, all of which is correct, by the way, and of course the symbolic effects, which you know about. And all of that together is incredibly powerful, as you know. And what it showed is this stuff, this cultural stuff, is moving forwards, is more important, that when you add all the little elements together, it is big. That's what that showed, all of that evidence. And what happened in that process was to break down old divides between high and low culture, professional, semi-professional, amateur, and so on. All were seen part of the overall resource, whether it was funded or commercial. And it also meant that we looked at places where culture takes place in different ways. So this happens to be Holzmarkt in Berlin, is a very vibrant place. It's on the river. You would have thought there would be a skyscraper. Long story, how they managed to keep this area. But you can see it looks chaotic, but there are so many people who are going there because it just somehow has some flavor of difference going on. So where culture takes place can be in many places. So what was really everything was about what is the public value of culture. And you could simplify by saying there's the intrinsic value. I'm just doing art because I love art and I just forget everybody else. Or the instrumental, which some artists will say, I don't want to be instrumentalized. I want to be me. Nevertheless, I think most things are instrumentalized one way or another. And then the third is the institutional. So the people who don't like the instrumental say, oh, it's only about money and so on. But one of the interesting things, as we well know, is that once you take culture in development seriously, what tends to happen is you get this problem. This is Zurich West, where you get lots of people knocking down buildings, building the Renaissance Hotel, all the cool companies are there, and then one artist says, you can't knock down my house, and puts in the same typeface as Renaissance, resistance. And that is the gentrification problem, dilemma for all of us. Hopefully it has not happened in Veszprém yet, but in bigger cities it happens all the time. So the wider conceptual frame, back to a bit the title of my talk, is cultural planning or planning culturally. And planning culturally, as you know, means looking at everything through the lens of what this culture is. And it reframes the argument and it restates, in a sense, the public value of culture, in my view, in a bigger way, and talks about, let's call it, the civic commons, the commons that we all are, that we daily shape and make this culture. And of course it links to things like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course all these other things like economic, social, and other values, and so on. Now, what are our resources? And what I'm about to say, of course you know, but I'm just trying to simplify. Of course, culture is who we are, where we come from and how we might become. And creativity helps shape what we can become. And that's the way, in simple terms, that I see this creative city thing. And of course, it's all about identity, and if I acknowledge my identity, life becomes slightly easier. And the big connection made, and many of you will have done that in your experience, is between culture, creativity, and the city, the place where the urbanity happens, this coming together. People you don't know, you have to say hello to them, you have to communicate with them, and so on. And for many, this was the answer for cities. And what this is about, this concept, creative city concept, it connects that triad between culture, creativity, and the city, and explores how places can navigate this transformation, urban transformation that is happening inevitably. And in this sense, city making is a cultural project, because it's about the values and habits and behavior and mindsets you have. What are the types of buildings you want? How do you want the buildings to speak to the street? Is there generosity in public space? Are there spaces created where we can connect with others? And of course it responds to the landscape and geology and weather and so on. That's why Tartu, of course, is different from, let me think of a hot place, Catania in Sicily. But anyway, another guiding principle is that there's this continual interplay in thinking about the creative city between culture wide, in the sense I was just saying it, and culture narrow as the arts. And a major manifestation of that cultural project, the city, is how the arts and creative economy help support all of that. And one sentence I really like, and it's something that came into my mind once: great creative city making or place making is more like improvised jazz than a well-tempered symphony performance. Can I just repeat that, for me at least? It's more like improvised jazz than a well-tempered symphony performance, which is why I talked about orchestration. And this new wave of creativity obviously came up when industries were declining, and you saw places like this happens to be in Poland, where we saw what are the opportunities that come. And the new thing that was basically the novelty was saying, hey, actually, it's self-consciously becoming a creative city. Of course, there were creative cities all through history. Siena is a creative place. They invented how we monitor finance and accounting and stuff like that. So there have always been creative places, but we more self-consciously said, we could become a creative place. And here the elements that come across are this creativity can be an engine, can be an energy, can be a resource, can be an opportunity, can be a form of capital and currency, and a catalyst to make things happen. And it also had, of course, preconditions. You had to be more open than closed. You have to be willing to reassess things afresh, to be able to say, what if we tried that? To see patterns and connections, and to balance, being all open, but then knowing you have to sometimes really focus on making something happen. You're not going to be creative 24/7. Hey, it's all cool. No, you have to also deliver. And you can think of this cycle of creativity quite easily. It starts with being curious, then allowing people to be imaginative. And then, if they're imaginative, they may have some creative ideas and may invent something, which leads to innovation that leads again to curiosity. And so what you've got here perhaps is a shift in paradigm. You have perhaps an empowering ethos. But when I thought about these things initially, I felt ordinary people can make the extraordinary happen if given the chance. And here, that is where this bigger story comes from, the planning culturally idea. The bigger story is that we want a culture of creativity, includes obviously the arts and all of that, but that affects social, scientific life, social innovations, business innovations. And one of my delightful things for me is bureaucratic innovation. I run a festival called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, which basically says people in the public administration are not necessarily stupid. Many of them have good ideas, but we need to explore them more. So there we are. So what we're doing here, we, I don't know who the we is creating the conditions for people to think, plan with imagination, to try and solve problems and to create opportunities. And that then thing reminds us again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the value added of the arts? And I think it's harnessing the imaginative capacities and critical capacities and trying to embed that type of thinking into all disciplines. And I keep on thinking, can't we just normalize the fact that that type of thinking, and that thinking, you don't have to be an artist to have that thinking. You could be a bureaucrat, you could be someone, you could work in a hospital to still have that thinking. You don't have to be a painter, a musician to have that thinking. But normalizing this so that these types of people with that mindset can change planning, can change and rethink health services, can look at social services, or help design bureaucracies, and so on. So I don't think this is instrumentalizing. I think this is enriching the possibilities of how placemaking can work. So what one then has got, I think I'm trying to say, is we've got a 360-degree perspective on things, which is interdisciplinary. It's blending the different forms of thinking together. It's understanding a bit how health services work. It's understanding finance. It's understanding cultural value, and so on together. And then I was thinking, another way of putting it is it's a glass half full approach. We know life is difficult, but let's start with a glass half full rather than empty. And turning weaknesses into strength. I remember, and our Tartu friends perhaps will know about this project, many years ago, 25 years ago, I was in Helsinki and I said, look, you've got so many light transitions, it's dark there often, why don't you start a festival of light? It's obvious, obviously, it's obvious retrospectively, which is just a reminder that there are so many ideas that can be had that could be interesting. And so what one's really doing is refocusing creativity on the big issues that really matter. And we know what some of those are, and they really mean that we have to think beyond the self. We know, obviously, it's about climate issues and so on. So this, of course, is Olafur Eliasson reminding us viscerally through our stomach, as well as everything else, that the ice is melting. It's true. Or here, a German artist in Ars Electronica, I saw this saying, population has risen. It is dangerous. When I was born, there were 2.1 billion people. They're about to be 8 billion. Of course, we're going to have more pandemics as you lift up the earth and do things. So the artist here is obviously very helpful. And obviously the problem is that it's easier, as one philosopher said, to imagine the fall of the world rather than to remake it. But here again, you know, we might move towards a hydrogen economy. But we can see how communication through arts and culture and creativity can be very powerful. Like here in New Zealand, where the river has a legal status. So if you think suddenly the river has a legal status, what's the voice of the river when you're making your decisions about the future of Veszprém or whatever? And here you will know this is Banksy, who said, hey, let's look at it the other way. Don't you tame me, lion. Let the lion tame you. This exhibition in Bristol had 400,000 visitors. There are only 250,000 people who live in Bristol, just in passing. So how you do an exhibition is really quite important. So another world is possible. Of course, we obviously need to sort out Planet A. We know that, everybody knows that. But this also is the biggest cultural project of our time, dealing with the transition in such a way that our civilization survives in a good way. And there is a yearning for this. When you speak to people, I feel everybody is yearning for solutions to some of these big projects. And perhaps precisely your sort of people, may be the answer to some of these problems. A friend of mine just down the road, he changes the words every few weeks, and he put luck down. And I thought, that's a bit grey. Let me just wait until the sun shines. Luck down. There were so many opportunities in COVID, but everybody then thought, my God, the past is an exotic destination, even though the birds were singing and the air was cleaner and everything else. So, you get the idea. Back to Banksy, just complaining about consumer culture. Anyway, there's finally just one major opportunity I want to highlight to create additional relevance. And this is just a small example. So there's more possible, even because of the digitalizing world, about what I'm about to say. So the creative process and its transdisciplinary links, okay. But what does it mean? Arts, science, and tech. Max Planck, you know, the Nobel Prize winner, said a pioneering scientist must have an artistically creative imagination. Well, if Max says it, it's true. Yeah, it must be true. But I happen to believe it's true. I've been in some of these projects. Time is over. Yeah, just 1 minute, darlings. Anyway, the extra of the arts is, of course, this vast research on arts and science and how scientific imagination is correlated to activism in creative activities like music and so on outside of science. And the statistics show the more a scientist is involved in the arts, the more prizes they get. There are more Nobel Prize winners who are involved in arts or elite scientists. In fact, elite scientists nearly 3 times as much. So for me, that's evidence. Anyway, you get the idea. So science moves towards proof, we know. Arts moves towards possibility. And tech, in theory, is supposed to help make it happen. So there we are. This is perhaps a new renaissance, blending the great ways of thinking, artistic thinking and knowing, and scientific and other ways of knowing, exploring, bringing these insights together, i.e. not working in a silo. So for me, it is less, as so many people have asked me, what is the value of culture, arts and creativity? But what is the cost of not valuing them? So there we are. Let's get that message across. Thank you very much.